aren't really probably going to even read a verse of 1 Kings today. We'll start next week. But really the question that I just want us to be focusing on is, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where Israel is now set up and it has a monarchy, has a king? And so I kind of want to just do a little bit of review, and we look at history here. And I first of all want us just to understand the dates that are being covered in 1 Kings, so we kind of have an idea of the time frame here. And so as we look at the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, we understand that traditionally that's one book. In the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings, it's the book of Kings. And so that covers a period from 970 to 586. And so you got, almost 400 years it's being covered. But then in 1 Kings, it's a little bit more concentrated. It's 970 BC to 850 BC. And one thing that I want us to understand, first of all, let me ask you this, Gary. What's this book all about? It's all about kings. Yeah, it's that easy, isn't it? But the interesting thing is, obviously, is that it's called 1 Kings, obviously, but at this point, by the time we get to Kings, we understand that the monarchy has already been established. And so we understand 1 Samuel, we read about King Saul being selected as the first king of Israel in 1040 BC. And then after that, we understand David is established as king in 1010 BC. But I want us to kind of just look at this timeline here. And again, how did we get to this point where we are now set up as a monarchy? And so we go back and we look in time, and we understand. We'll start just with kind of the Exodus here, and we'll draw a little pyramid. My drawing skills are really, really good. That's Egypt right there. That's a pyramid for Egypt. And so we got the Exodus here, and that took place in 1446 BC. And then you have wandering going on during this time, and then eventually you get to the Promised Land, which is in, we'll draw a tree for that, right? So it's lush and beautiful in the Promised Land, and that's 1406. Okay? And so you get to the Promised Land, and then it kind of skips a generation. At this point, when you first get to the Promised Land, we understand that it was Moses that led them there. Joshua takes over. They enter the Promised Land, and it's kind of this high point in Israel's history, where it's this great generation. They're faithful to God. They're doing exactly what He says. And so we kind of skip a generation, and all of a sudden we get to about 1375 here. And we will draw, let's see here, we'll draw a gavel. How about that? Do the best I can with it. Ooh, that's rough. Okay. That's a gavel for judges, right? Okay, so we get to this period of Judges in 1375, which lasts for about 300 years, about 300 years or so, 330 years. And so then we finally get to 1040 BC, and that's where we have that monarchy is set up there with King Saul. But up to this point, what I want us to understand is that this monarchy wasn't always what God had in mind. It wasn't always what God's ideal was for Israel. You see there in Egypt, they go out of, they leave Egypt, and that's the Exodus there. And you have Moses that's kind of serving God. He's a spokesperson for God. He's certainly a leader, but it's God is the one that everybody turns to, that everybody's serving. Then all of a sudden, you get to this point in Judges. And everybody, it's a downward spiral from there. We see this pattern in Judges where people are serving different idols, and they'll stop being faithful to God, and then God will send them into captivity, and then He raises up a judge, and then He brings them out of captivity, and you just rinse and repeat. But kind of interesting, the whole theme of Judges, does anybody know what the whole theme of Judges is? What's the very last verse say in Judges? In Judges chapter 21, verse 35. Somebody want to read that? Or do they know what that says?
Is that where it says they were man right in his own sight?
Yeah, there was no king in Israel during those days. Everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. Well, that's really interesting. We'll come back to that. But for right now, I want us to recognize kind of the outline of 1 Kings here. In 1 Kings, we'll look at chapters 1 through 4, and that's going to be Solomon in all his glory. And when I say Solomon in all his glory, you probably think of, the material things that he accomplished, and that's certainly part of it. But chapters 1 through 4, we're looking at Solomon at his best. He prays to God for wisdom, and he remains faithful to God. He's doing what he says, and we know eventually that tapers off. But we also look at the accomplishments, and we'll see during the time where he's building the temple that the Queen of Sheba is going to come and even visit to hear of his wisdom. But then chapters 5 through 8, that's all him building the temple and getting the materials to do that and how he accomplished that. And we get this amazing temple that's dedicated to God, where God's going to dwell among Israel, and it's the likes of something that Israel is never going to see again once it's eventually destroyed, as we understand. And then we get to the divided kingdom, where Jeroboam, he takes over, and you have the kingdom, it's divided between the north and the south. And then we get to the days of Elijah, which is also extremely exciting, and we read about his interactions with Ahab, who was an especially wicked king in Israel during that time. And so we kind of consider the themes of 1st and 2nd Kings here. First of all, the book of Kings is written as a book of history. That's something we need to understand. It is a book of history. These are things that actually happened. A lot of the things are easy to imagine that they would happen. We read about David on his deathbed. We read about kings taking up the mantle of the king before them. We see nations go to war. But then there's things that are hard to comprehend. We see Elijah outrun Ahab's chariots, which is crazy. But people they go to these certain miraculous events and they say, "Come on, you don't seriously believe that." But the thing we have to remember as we're reading about these miraculous events is that we believe in a God that spoke the earth, the world, into existence, don't we? And once you accept that, you understand this world plays by his rules, and he can do whatever he wants with it. Everything's easy to understand and accept at that point. So this is the book of Kings is written as a book of history. But when the author began writing it, because it's understood to be written by one author, he already knew how the story would end. So remember, 1st and 2nd Kings, that's one book, and he understands when he starts writing 1st Kings, opening with David on his deathbed, he already knows how this is going to end 400 years ago. He's writing it, and it's revisionist, well, not revisionist history, he's just writing a history book. And so therefore the book of Kings, like all history books, was written so that we might learn something, right? Why do we go back and study history? So we don't repeat it, right? Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Well, it's the same thing that we have here. It goes back. The author probably wrote it around the time that, Babylon takes Israel into captivity. And so he's writing it, and this is history that's written down for us so that we don't repeat it. And there's going to be a lot of good application and spiritual lessons we can take away from this. And so it reveals the ultimate result of what will happen when man makes a departure from God and his intended plan. That is, to me, as you read the book of Kings, that is really what it is there to teach us. What happens when man chooses man over God? When man goes with their own plans instead of going with God's ideal plan. And we're going to see that, again, there's some initial success, but eventually it falls off. And so the reason why I say that it's a book written and given to us, and it shows us what happens when man makes a departure from God's plan, is because, again, as I mentioned before, this idea of a monarchy was not God's ideal plan. Having a man sit on the throne of God is what it is, and how it's referred to in Chronicles when Solomon takes over. And so we read statements such as the one we find here in Hosea 13:11, when he says, "I gave you a king in my anger." This isn't something that God necessarily wanted for the people of Israel. But just because he didn't want it does not mean that he didn't know it was going to happen, which is another important thing to understand. How do we know that this was going to happen? We find out in Genesis that there's going to be kings that descend from Abraham, don't we? In Genesis chapter 17 and verse 6, we read that God says to Abraham, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you." The very first, interaction on the first, prophecy that's given here to Abraham, he tells him kings are going to come from you. And what we call that here, we call this foreknowledge, because we understand that God knows things are going to happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what he wants to happen. We have past knowledge, don't we? We can look back and we can see what took place in the past, but we aren't able to do anything about it, and we don't do anything about it. God's able to look forward. He's able to see what's going to happen. And I think it's because he loves us so much that he doesn't interfere. He gives us free will. He allows us to make our own choices, and he allows us to choose him. And that's really what's going to make us that much more special in his eyes when we do opt to choose him. This isn't the only time this kind of statement is made. In the same chapter, when God is promising a son to Abraham, and he says of Sarah, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. And then we read even in Deuteronomy, right before the nation of Israel goes in to take over the promised land. You know, Deuteronomy is a series of, I think, 6 speeches by Moses. And he says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around you. You may indeed set a king over you, which, notice that, he says you may do it. It's not something that it sounds like he necessarily wants. He's simply saying that I'll allow that to happen, and that's okay. But he says, you may indeed set a king over you, who the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So he's already giving regulations of what they're to do when they appoint a king. But what I want us to see is this is something that God knew was going to happen, but what I also want us to understand is that this isn't what God's ideal was for the nation of Israel. And so with that, we understand that we always have a choice. We always have a choice. We think about foreknowledge and God knowing what's going to happen. He also, Acts chapter 2, talks about how God foreknew that Jesus, his son, would die on the cross, that happened according to his foreknowledge. But he also says that it was the Jews that took him with lawless hands, right, and killed and crucified him. They weren't supposed to do that, but God knew it was going to happen. Yeah, somebody have a question? Yeah, Brett.
Just what God told Samuel when they wanted the king.
Yeah.
They haven't rejected you.
For Samuel 8.
They rejected me for Samuel 8.
Yeah, and we'll talk about
They
that.
rejected me from being king.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, Brian?
Another, I guess, a thing that history is good to study is it shows God's intervention throughout history to make sure the lineage continues till we get to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It's threaded throughout the entire Bible, you know, whether you're talking about Rahab the harlot or somebody else, it's threaded throughout the entire history.
Yeah, not only that, but as we study Kings, we realize that when a man is sitting on God's throne, it just doesn't work. And we need that perfect. We need somebody from the Godhead to reign as king. And when it's left to man, things just get messed up. I mean, we see that pattern over and over throughout the Bible. Any other comments or questions? Okay. So I do have another question, a follow-up question here, as we're considering our choice to choose our own plan or God's. What causes us to choose man's plan over God's? I heard stupidity. Is that what somebody said?